Right. You know, when we used to first have the multi-access system in DSM, and when teaching residents, one of the things that will often be asked is, well, when you have somebody with some really chronic and pervasively disabling illness such as chronic schizophrenia, does it really make sense to ask that patient about personality disorders and think about access to it when you have such a pervasively extreme disorder that sort of defines that person's life? Does it really make sense? I'm reminded of that when I see these kinds of stories. And we treat antisocial personality disorder a little bit differently in all kinds of places, such as state rules where you can't commit a patient thanks to diagnosis, whereas you could with borderline diagnosis. I mean, when we talk about the most extreme version of the psychopathic, criminal, antisocial patients, does it really make sense to think about that kind of person the same way we're thinking about the personality disorders, with some hope that we can reach them? Or is this, or would it make sense to even look at what does it matter that someone with this kind of extreme antisocial psychopathy might also have borderline personality disorder and meet the threshold?
Well, I think that somebody like Cindy Henry, who was treated in such a horrific way, if she had been more fortunate and picked up by some school or by some service for dealing with her, maybe even taking away from the home, from the graveyard home, and putting him in a better foster home or something. So I think there would be a stage in which some of those people, I think, could have been rescued. There are others who have, let's say, the tendency to psychopathy on a strong and genetic basis, where I don't think one is going to do anything. So, but if you can pick out at some point, differentiate the ones who are the most from birth and callous and uncaring and remorseful and sadistic, and I think, well, we may have to separate them from society. We're not going to be able to help them. But there's other ones who come from ruinous homes who can be made to look and even begin to act the ways that the criminals do, but who are more salvageable if they had been, if interventions were introduced earlier, so that it is worth, I think, making this.
Good, thanks. All right, we have one last presentation, and this is going to be a presentation by Charleston, and Dr. Charleston is professor of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut Health Center, who's been very interested in the forensics world as well, and also in the personality disorder field. He's currently director of the Center for Correctional Mental Health Services Research, and of the University of Connecticut Health Center's signature program, which is called Connecticut Health, and that's really dedicated to public sector care and public health.
The work I want to talk about certainly is done under the support of the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Justice. I also have funding from Abbott Neuroscience and Lilly as well for similarly small percentages of my time, similar to what Dr. Caccaro would say. This is done with many, many collaborators, and for others at another point are interested in the challenges of doing research in a correctional environment with people who are incarcerated and protected by that, in addition to being mentally ill. Please feel free to discuss it with me. It's a challenging issue. What I hope to do today in the next few minutes is just talk about some of the issue and the extent of incarceration of those with borderline personality disorder, discuss some of the potential risk factors, review some of the relevant treatments and interventions, and think a bit about the future. There are a couple of basic facts that I just wanted to allude and focus us on. We've already heard several presentations today, and I think it's no surprise to anyone in the audience that separate from the specific criteria, impairment really has to exist in two or more areas, typically in interpersonal function, emotion regulation, perception or interpretation of self or others, and an impulse control. And it has to be substantial, pervasive, and at least historically persistent. It's also become very clear that many people in correctional systems present with disturbed behavior parallel to the interpersonal difficulties that they demonstrated in the community. And it's really this intersection that I wanted to focus on. That if we focus much more than we heretofore have on this population, we can really make a difference. And I think that this population is one, unlike many of the people that Mike Stone just discussed, are far more than salvageable. They are really habilitatable and can be restored to a high level of function and health. And it's a fascinating issue and challenge for us. I think there's pretty much a consensus, as we've heard several times today from multiple presenters, that there's a high elevation of borderline personality disorder in inpatient psych units, the public health and National Health Service notwithstanding, and that the frequencies are just as high in prisons. We know that for antisocial personality disorder, almost tautologically, there is elevation in jails and prisons. With borderline personality disorder, these numbers have been mentioned, but I really have to hammer them home. Think about an environment where 12% of the men meet criteria for borderline personality disorder, and an environment where over a quarter of all the women meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. Then think about whether or not you'd be willing to function as a superintendent or warden of such an environment. These are real challenges that we are focusing on in the real world. In data that's currently in review, we had done an epidemiologic study using the SCID-2 in Connecticut's 5 jails and found data consistent with this. High elevations of cluster B, and in particular for men, borderline personality disorder, consistent with what has been published elsewhere, over 12% of men and 23% of women. There is very, very high comorbidity of PTSD, very, very high comorbidity of substance abuse. And I need to mention this, and I think all of us as clinicians know that DSM doesn't work in the real world. That the comorbidities overwhelm our ability to make use of these diagnoses as a categorical diagnosis. If, for example, you have a patient with an uncomplicated unipolar major depression, you're pretty clear about what kind of intervention you're likely going to use and the sequence of them. If someone has a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, that diagnostic category does not inform treatment very effectively, as a general rule, because of the 256 different possible configurations that people may have. And so we are really challenged with this in the community. Now, in prison, it's far worse. 40% of people who are incarcerated have a history of traumatic brain injury. At least 70% are chronic substance abusers. And they're not simply abusing pharmaceutical-grade pills. Much of the substances they ingest or inject include neurotoxins that may be irreversible. So into this environment, you are trying to treat people with high comorbidities that make clean diagnoses very, very hard. One of the studies that Jeremy Cohen has conducted but didn't discuss was some of the issues about the correlates of personality disorder. And in particular, just the incarceration rate, the odds ratio in cluster B of spending time in prison, criminal conviction, or institutional care are anywhere from 7 to 18 times those in the community. In the United States, in contrast to the very modest 75,000 people that are in prisons in England, we have approximately 2 million of our citizens in jails and prisons on any given day. Of those, about 300,000 meet criteria for serious mental illness. And the slide, I think, speaks for itself in terms of our deinstitutionalization initiative, which really is trans-institutionalization, as most of us acknowledge, that people have been relocated, particularly more seriously mentally ill, have been relocated from our mental institutions into correctional environments. Now, what about people with personality disorders per se? Particularly, and notably, those with borderline personality disorder as a core diagnostic entity. They're disproportionately at risk of incarceration because of the nature of the illness and of the categorical and dimensional criteria. Impulsivity and the impulsive aggression, particularly the kind that Emil Picaro had discussed so eloquently earlier. The affective instability, the perceptual distortions that can really make clear understanding of relationships or environments very, very difficult and challenging. And it's important for another discussion to remember that each of these characteristics, biologically inherited traits, if you will, in different environments are survival characteristics. We don't want to get rid of them. We do not want to get rid of them in our gene pool, but we do want to work with people to help to support a transformation to allow them to cope with these more effectively. In terms of development etiology, you've heard snippets from some of the theorists today, certainly from John Lisley, as well as what we've discussed and had presented as well about some of the five-factor models of Costa, about Cloninger's dimensional approaches. But we know that it is a genetic vulnerability coupled with environmental experience. And as Mike Stone had just mentioned in some of the more extreme cases, but even in more of the modest cases, we know, at least in correctional settings, many experience violence as a normative experience. And many have very low or absent sense of self-esteem. Something that Jeremy had said in a paper a few years ago in terms of borderline personality disorder in correctional settings, that behavior disorders can be perceived as the outcome of this instability in interpersonal relationships, in self-image and affect, and it can be accompanied by impulsivity within that subject. This is a classic description of someone who is likely going to be arrested. So how do people present in a correctional environment? They are problems. That's what they're called in a correctional environment. There are many other much more flowery words that might be used, or much more pejorative ones. But the problems, they absorb a disproportionate amount of time and energy within correctional environments. And they create disruption, they create, because of the problems they have that are part of themselves, that have not been adequately treated or addressed in the community. They bring these into an environment that does not tolerate emotional outbursts, lack of control, lack of rigid adherence to rules. In yet another of Dr. Cohen's publications, when I put this together a while back, I didn't realize Jeremy was going to be here, so it's nice. Correct me if I'm misquoting anything, please. But something that is really, really critical in all of this work is that people with personality disorders, while they are prisoners, while they're in prison, create major problems. And based on their diagnoses, Dr. Cohen didn't look at what kinds of problems and behavioral disturbances they had conducted or created. It's interesting to go into this. I highly recommend this article for anyone involved in this field. But in terms of borderlines, hostage taking, because of that sense of insecurity, seems to be one of substantial risk. Odds ratio has increased 4 to 1 as well. But they're not someone who is very likely to attack staff. That isn't something that happens very often. It's just the opposite. The prevalence rates are highly elevated, as I've mentioned. And the impulsive difficulties, the emotional instability, sets the stage both for huge problems and real opportunities. And almost, wearing my other hat, it's a public health issue for us, and it's an enormous opportunity. When people are in an environment where they are contained. You can potentially structure interventions to make a difference. And so these are the kinds of things that started us down this path in our research group at the University of Connecticut. The problems they have in terms of being manipulative and provocative, nevertheless, there are, as we all know, clearly opportunities to help provide skills that these folks can use to avoid these kinds of problems that are pandemic for them. In correctional environments, you get disciplinary reports or tickets for misbehavior that can end up in segregation, 23-hour-a-day lockdown, restriction of privileges, inability to write letters, get phone calls, or visit with people from the outside world. They're very high utilizers of medical and mental health services in correctional settings as well as in the community. We can make a difference. We absolutely can make a difference. And the approach is logically, as we've heard, presented in multiple ways and has been reflected through the work of John Oldham, Mike Stone, Paul Solif, and many others in the guidelines. The APA continue to support psychotherapy as a primary intervention as well as medication management. I don't have time to get into the medication management issues here. I just want to mention that in an NIMH grant that I have, as a research infrastructure grant, we're working to build a decision support process for treatment in collaboration with Drs. Tricia Surtees and John Rush at the University of Texas to try to take the treatment algorithms that were developed, particularly for bipolar disorder, and adapt them for use in correctional settings and build on that to build best practice within correctional environments for the psychopharmacology. In terms of the interventions, though, in terms of psychotherapy, it's important that we can teach people to recognize problematic situations and emotions, that we can help them to maintain an optimal level of stimulation, to develop problem-solving skills, and to enhance structural and interpersonal boundaries. There are many different interventions that have been adapted for use in correctional environments. None of them to date really have an evidence basis to them. The one potential exception is dialectical behavior therapy, which, when Dr. Berzins and I published this paper a few years ago, had been adapted in correctional environments, primarily in forensic hospitals, but in a couple of prisons. But it was, keep in mind, when something is adapted from its original environment, it's no longer what we consider an evidence-based treatment. It's only evidence-informed, because you've taken it from the environment in which it's been tested, and you're putting it in a new one with many new demand characteristics. So one of the things that we had begun to develop in collaboration and support from the National Institute of Justice was an adaptation of dialectical behavior therapy for use in prisons with extremely limited resources, with high structure in the milieu, and to target this for use with mentally ill men, mentally ill women, and mentally ill and particularly impulsively aggressive teenage boys. We're one of the 3 enlightened states in Connecticut, in the United States, that actually adjudicates 16 and 17-year-old boys as adults. So we have a 650-bed adolescent male prison in Connecticut. There continues to be a large group of people collaborating with us in this, including Dr. Andrei Ivanov of Columbia, who was one of the early individuals trained by Dr. Linehan in this. So we were looking specifically at whether or not an adaptation, particularly the skills training components, would show a decrease in aggression, decrease in impulsivity, and decrease in psychopathology after completing the skills group sessions. And then, subsequently, can participants who are randomly assigned to receive either subsequent individual psychotherapy, DBT coaching, will show decreased aggression, decreased impulsivity, and decreased psychopathology compared to those simply receiving an equivalent amount of time of case management for 8 weeks, and then looking at 6-month and 12-month follow-ups. So this is the study design. This was approved by the our institutional review board, as well as the Health and Human Services Office of Human Research Protection, whenever you do a randomized study within a correctional environment. So the key issue to remember is prisons have no money for psychotherapy. They lock people up, and whatever you say otherwise, there's extraordinarily limited, meaningful psychotherapy in most prison environments. There are some interventions, there's some programs, but it's very, very difficult. There are several locations that have actually spent the money and engaged in an enormous training initiative to get formal DBT into a correctional environment, really two of them. One was the Bedford Hills Prison for Women in the New York State system. The other was a prison in the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Springfield, Missouri. Both worked with Dr. Linehan's group and really developed this. The Federal Bureau of Prisons is an ongoing initiative with some difficulties. Unfortunately, there's been such turnover at the Bedford prison that it's no longer a meaningful program, as I heard last when I spoke with folks in New York. So what we were trying to do in this study was really try to see, bottom line, will the skills groups alone make a difference? Dr. Linehan's work has shown repeatedly that they won't make a difference by themselves in the community setting. This isn't a community setting, and this isn't a setting with a lot of money. Is there a way for us to structure the basic skills groups for effective use in a highly structured prison environment that will benefit the population? And does it make a difference if you have additional psychotherapy that reinforces the skills training groups? And obviously I don't have time to go into the whole details. Suffice it to say, we employed DBT intensive trained clinicians who worked through the whole process as researchers in this at 3 different prisons. The Garner Correctional Institution, which is the largest mental health treatment facility for men in Connecticut. It's a maximum security prison. The Manson Youth Institution, as I recently described, and the York Correctional Institution for Women. And we have been able, we're not completed yet, so I just kind of was able to scramble and get this data. It has not yet been scoured, cleaned, vetted, so this is premature data, but nevertheless I wanted to share where we are in these studies with you. So that there are 120, okay, so there are 124 people who have participated in this study at baseline before the group. There was close to a 50% decrease in participants after the 16 weeks. We can go into that. That's fairly standard in correctional environments. People don't stay still. They're transferred from one prison to another, and so forth. And at the second follow-up, 6 months later, down to 37, and we have not completed the 12-month samples. These are inherent challenges in prison-based work. By the way, we blew up the manual. We rewrote it at a 5th grade reading level. We made it very iconic and tried to restructure it so that people could actually interpret and understand it in a meaningful way in these different environments. We had a range of measures that we used in this. The demographics I'll just skip over. But I wanted to point out that these, in the men's facility, the physical fight history, the physical fight history was very high, 10 or more, verbal arguments, assaults, suicide attempts, well over, in this population, 40% of the included individuals 2 or more times, 10 or more times was about 5%, high suicidality population. Similar in the youth institution, which we don't have time to get into. The basic results of this intervention at the beginning of the intervention versus the end, in this quasi-experimental design, was in particular from the bus-Perry aggression inventory, a clinically significant and statistically significant drop in their expression of physical aggression and anger expression, as well as irritability. So in key areas, although not in every area, but in certain key areas, this limited intervention, 32 sessions over 16 weeks, had substantial benefit. And when we looked at the follow-up for those 37 individuals who did complete the additional 8-week randomization, case management versus consultation for DBT reinforcing with individual reinforcement of the skills. We then did paired comparisons of these 37 who continued in that study until we were able to get follow-up data. Of these 37 people, the bottom line is in terms of deterioration in function overall in the 8 weeks where they were in randomization, there was no deterioration back to baseline in those 2 months, which for some of these folks was remarkable, given that some of them started out in handcuffs in these groups. And, like 5 minutes? Great, thank you. Okay. And that there was no substantial, no clinically significant, no statistically significant difference in those 8-week periods of the DBT, those corrections modified versus case management. So there was no deterioration in function and no difference between case management and the individual reinforcement. Now, this is something that I really need to emphasize. We worked really hard with the custody staff and the mental health staff to reinforce that this wasn't what they colloquially called yet another hug-a-thug program, but rather these were skills-based interventions to try to assist in improving the safety and security of the environment and to empower the individuals to reduce the likelihood of reoffending and reincarceration. They buy into that. These are not people who, if you ever want to find the basic haven of Skinnerians in the world, go into the prison system. That's where pure raw behaviorists are. That's where the custody staff are behaviorists. And so if you give them that context, it works for them. So we're going to be continuing the collection of the rest of the data and the analysis of the follow-ups. Because of issues of copyright and intellectual property, we have taken that data that we have gathered and we have worked with the basic skills that we found were key and critical and converted that into something that is going to be in the public domain. It will not be copyrighted. Something called Start Now, which includes characteristics of general cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed care, motivational enhancement therapy with correctional modifications. So it's written at a 4th grade reading level, very, very iconic, and highly structured to allow for its use in multiple settings. And we're now working with the National Institute of Corrections and the federal BOP and several state systems to begin to look at the potential beta testing of this program that grew out of our work with DBT that we hope to get further information on. Take-home message, high prevalence of borderline personality disorder in correctional environments. These are people who are very treatable. And for most of us who have treated people in the community, we kind of have a little lacuna in the sense that we forget that many of them have already been arrested and we're only seeing them in the community. We can make a difference. We can keep them out of jails and prisons by developing and enhancing our knowledge base with this population, destigmatizing it, and really working as advocates for this population. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. I think that's a wonderful, optimistic closing note for today, and I'm delighted to hear about this work. There's not enough of this going on, and it's hard to do, you don't emphasize that. But I know it is, and it's a tough population to work with. We are at our closing hour, and you've all been very patient and very attentive. I think we've heard a lot of terrific information today. We will have another very rich day tomorrow, not quite as long. And we will wish you all a lovely evening. We'll conclude at that point. I'm reminded to ask you to sign out and then sign in again tomorrow. And we'll start again at 8 tomorrow morning. Thank you all.